I'm Aaron Sullivan. I am representing the OCP Incubation Committee and the OCP Foundation. I am a co-chair of that committee, and I have been on that committee in some sense since near the beginning of OCP's existence as a foundation and a working group. I also am a director of hardware engineering at Facebook. But primarily I want to talk to you about a much longer time span. I've only been at Facebook for about a year, at OCP about 7 now. And what I want to talk to you about is on the subject of what you can learn from stories like the ones that we tell, and my observation of stories like the sort that OCP adopters tell and early OCP designers tell to help you get started in this. There's a lot of useful information that we can share, but part of that is your own journey. So I want to stress before I get started any further, this is not a technical talk. This is a talk about organizational behavior around adopting open source technologies, principally. And after we finish, there will be a panel session. If you looked at your schedule, you might have noticed there's a Q&A session with other people here. And I hope that our other panelists spend most of the time talking, because I'll be spending the next 20 minutes or so with you. So let's just talk just for a bit about how the next 20 minutes will spend. First of all, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my career journey and my observations on IT organizations as they've existed over the last 30 years or so, and a little bit about how the closed and open cycle seems to work. And you're going to hear some themes reflected that John Laban shared earlier today. We did not plan this. It just so happens, I guess, we think somewhat the same way. We didn't even talk about it, but I was surprised to see that he included that content, so that's great. And then when we finish talking about that, I want to discuss just a bit how I think all of that information might apply to you, and a little bit about what I've learned that it's like to listen to a Hyperscale talk when you're an audience member. Then I want to talk a little bit about moving beyond this weird cycle that we tend to get into when attending events like this or in community with people that have adopted and deployed this kind of technology already, or interacting with those that are looking forward to doing it but haven't yet. Finally, I'll give you some tips on how to get started here, just basic things that I've learned that can make a big difference to organizations as they begin the process. I seem to be having a problem again. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's start with just the basic stage. My journey in tech, I've been in the field a little over 20 years now, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, and then I'm going to kind of profile organizations a bit, and then I'm going to provide you with a personal confession, which I think maybe you'll feel entertained with. So let's start with just a little bit to help relate. I began my career in enterprise IT and support and network back office. One of my first big projects was migrating a very old networking platform for a big bank from token ring to gigabit Ethernet. They made a big leap from 16 megabit token ring to gigabit Ethernet. And I also worked on a conversion from an ATM network core to an Ethernet core. And many of you in the room, if you've been in networking, may not have even really been paying attention when that was going on. But I can remember how obsessively we talked about all these elements of ATM, and nobody even really remembers it anymore or cares about what was special there. Then I spent some time in security and moved over to managed service provider business. And manage networking services, basically helping big companies defend their networks and also expand and develop their network cores and their edges. I spent some time in a carrier voice over IP for 2 big American telcos, and I spent my last few years in that particular part of the industry in an IPTV service development job doing infrastructure. I moved from that into Hyperscale. I worked for a company called Rackspace for a number of years and joined OCP with Rackspace, focused on all of the cloudy stuff that we do today and developing infrastructure there, and then got into a strategic role doing some development of hardware here in the open compute community. Finally, I moved over to Facebook, but that's not really the relevant part of this story. What I want you to look at here is the timeline and just basically a trend of done work in big brands, done work in telco, done work in enterprise, and Hyperscale came later. So most of my programming is from a more traditional environment. And I've also spent time on both ends of the universe in terms of infrastructure services and product development in all of these different aspects that you see up on the screen. And a lot of the infrastructure development that I've done has gone fairly deep in each one of these verticals. So I've lived the life of a network engineer in enterprises and telco cores. I've done a lot of work in storage development, and especially in the last 7 years or so, a fair bit in compute, especially advanced processing, sort of world after Moore's law. In my experience, most of the work that I've done in pursuit of these three goals only tends to result in a better TCO when we land in the middle, when we land in this part of the spectrum. When I've just gone after performance for the sake of performance, scale for the sake of scale, or service and features for the sake of those things, typically I end up paying more. But when I go through the process of kind of reinventing to hit a goal, I tend to get better value overall in the end. That's been my experience deploying infrastructure. So that's just a little bit about me. I want to talk just a bit about our industry as well in association with open source. In my view, we have a bunch of very common elements in place and patterns in our industry's behavior. The first one is, if you're in an industry that is going through a lot of change, that could be a bad thing, but often value maintains or increases. And when you're in part of an industry that is no longer changing and kind of stabilizing, or an environment, value tends to go down because there's generally not as much innovation happening in the space where change has stopped. And so people just continually want the same thing for less. And that tends to produce a reduction in value. Then we also have, to my point of view in our industry for many decades now, the same fundamentals at work all the time, but we come into it in new circumstances. And so what is actually the same might feel different because of where we are, but I do believe that we tend to just basically go in loops in some sense. And most of our technological development starts more proprietary and it ends more open. John also talked about in his talk that open source has been going on for a long time, and he showed some very old computers, and we talked about mainframe and Linux. And the intent of this image that I'm sharing with you is just to take a look at these eras of computing in some sense, going all the way back to mainframes and mini computers, where we really have had, even in the most proprietary systems, some encroachment of open source and open standards. And it shows up in different flavors in each of these eras until we had really fully open source software. And there's always a proprietary option, but open source tends to bring more and more into place. And more recently, we have a lot of sort of proprietary product and service that is based on a lot of open source software. And I believe the same will probably happen with hardware. And I don't think this blending is really a problem. The world might be better if we all shared, but in some sense, it's quite natural to understand that not everybody always does, even when they're using open source. So now I want to talk just for a minute about profiling organizations. We're going to use this theme quite a bit more over the next little bit, but I think we're all on a few spectrums. If you were to categorize people in an IT organization today, I think you could reasonably well describe everybody as existing on these spectrums and come out with some common themes. And I think, depending on where you land on these spectrums, the way that I've presented it, if people's points on the spectrum all landed in one area, one range of each one of these lines, you might describe them using terms like this. My change over the last 10 years, I plotted differently in my first 10 years, looked something like this. So just follow those arrows, and wherever the arrow moves is an indicator of whether or not I think I've grown a little bit more conservative or a little bit more open-minded and liberal in some sense. Really, the only big change for me is that I don't believe there's much that's new, but I do believe there's a lot of value in being a little bit more practical about some invention of our own, some adoption of what's new. So if you bucketed me, I would self-categorize as somebody who is quite practical about decision-making and behavior in information technology. So now to the confession. When my company first got into OCP, I was one of 2 engineers that sort of worked on our infrastructure strategy, as it were, and I was not the fan of OCP. The person who introduced you all, Mark Roenig, I worked with him at our previous company, and this engineer and Mark and a few others were big fans of this for recognizable reasons. And what I saw when I looked at it was the opportunity for a lot of wasted time, a lot of confusion, and a big mess. And it wasn't because I didn't believe in open source. It was because I looked at the people involved in it at the time and I thought, you're all a bunch of crazy revolutionary thinkers, and I don't have time for that. I will appreciate what you do in a few years, but I don't want to get caught up in it now. I think it will be difficult for us to build something meaningful amongst so much chaos. And most open source movements and revolutions in general tend to do that. I came around. This is a picture of the team that I worked with that deployed our first open compute systems. As you can see, none of us have celebrity looks. None of us had celebrity brains. None of us had any of those things. And many of us did come from backgrounds that were quite distinct from what you might expect to find in open compute. Some people were really experienced in the industry, but only one person on this team came from manufacturing background. A couple of people on this team in our supply chain division came from quite conservative backgrounds. We had program management, we had lab technicians. This is the whole team that took us from no OCP infrastructure to OCP infrastructure deployed at scale, and even the creation of some new systems with some of our partners. And it turned out I was wrong and that open source hardware is a good idea. And this is just a graph from IHS Markit, which I'm putting here just for your reference to show that the growth rate for OCP, while it started quite small, is moving along at a pretty good clip. We'll talk more on the markets a little bit later. So let's just talk for a minute about veteran IT and what I recall from my time in it. And I want to do this to build a little bit of a relation with those of you that are still on the adopting end and in organizations that have been operating on some other technology stack for a long time. So when in my time working in bigger organizations on veteran IT shops, these are the things that I loved about working in those organizations. They spent enough time and developed enough maturity that documentation tended to be reasonably good. There's always better. They tended to have a system that was fairly well defined for how to be successful and how to roll out new infrastructure. It was fairly rule-based. It was difficult to fake it in some sense. You know, like you could get labeled as a faker pretty quickly if you didn't know what you were doing. People really tended to succeed best when they married smarts with a practical sensibility and they didn't tolerate any bullshit, especially new technology bullshit. But what I also recognized in those environments is that sometimes we evolved into something that if you would have heard people speaking when we were thinking about new technology or new services, we would have maybe said things like this. Especially this notion that I just outsource a lot of my work through my suppliers and that we don't need much change. And it's easy for people listening to conversation like that to assume that the reason that happens is because people that work in those organizations are just innately lazy and boring and dumb and they don't care and all the rest of that. And I think this is terribly wrong. I think the reason why most veteran IT organizations develop the way that they are is that they came from something new and chaotic. And at some point in time, they lost their tolerance of a great deal of change because all of that change drove chaos in their organizations and didn't bring a lot of value. So we end up in that space by solving problems. You tick all these boxes, including the last two, and you just get into a place where you're not really interested in a lot of change, even though you may have a business that's running exceptionally well. And if it's running exceptionally well, it's harder to motivate for that change. So there's this natural evolution as you're going along in this process from moving on the side of that chart, the right-hand side of that chart, towards the left, towards something that's more conservative and safer. Because successful veteran IT shops value one thing more than anything else. They value uptime. And so we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about value in some sense. You remember I opened talking about TCO. I want to talk a little bit about value in open source. So there's a lot of value here in this space that many of you have recognized, and I'm just going to spend some time characterizing it, maybe a little bit more broadly and trying to dispel some misconceptions. And some of you are familiar with this metaphor for open source. There's free open source, and in open source, there's free as in beer, and there's free as in freedom. And beer is cheap, sometimes doesn't cost you anything if somebody else has paid for it. It's plentiful in our world. Maybe some of you would say not plentiful enough. And usually, what it took for us to get that great product was very much paid for by somebody else. And then there's freedom. Freedom is usually not free in some sense. All the innovation and the ideas and everything else that we make out there, it tends to cost us something. It tends to cost human capital, money, and all the rest of that. And while freedom is great, and it's a part of the open source movement, freedom is not cheap. So I think both of these characteristics exist in open source today, and we'll talk about more of that in just a moment. But I want you to think about combustion vehicles versus electric vehicles for just a minute, because in the end, there's this thing about cost and the freedom to innovate. Okay? A combustion vehicle today has a great deal of advantage in all of these infrastructural characteristics that we've built up to support it. They're predictable. We can make them at a pretty good cost. We've really wrung out most of the problems with these sorts of things, and they're quite reliable. And if you wanted to, do a revolution in automobiles, it's going to be hard to do it on a combustion engine because we've pretty much done everything that there is to do, and we're just doing incremental enhancements at this point. It's not this sea change. In electric vehicles, we can make a lot of the same things and just end up with a car, but we can also introduce some real revolutions. But in the beginning, the world is against us. There's all this other change that has to come with it for this car to be successful. Electrical charging stations, maybe new changes in the supply chain, changes in design practices, all kinds of things. And so it's not so easy to get that freedom off the ground into a working product. And the problem is, when most people think about open source, especially when they're thinking about movements like ours, and I saw this with Linux as well, is they don't realize that open source is both, but it's not both at the same time in all the same ways. You can use open source to get you all the freedom that you want, and it will probably give you the latitude to go there in ways that would be much more costly if you did it by yourself than doing it in a community. But you're going to pay the cost of freedom in the same sense you do with an electric car. On the other hand, open source does provide you that free beer aspect. I think probably most of you are operating on some very low-cost version of Linux right now. You have a choice for a more costly one, but that is Linux after a long, long maturation process, not what we had at the very beginning. It would have been costly to try and operate on Linux in the very early days for most big organizations, and so they waited for it to grow up. So you should be thinking about which aspects of open source you want to take advantage of, and then thinking about the bundled attributes of them as you're moving along in your experience here inside of the OCP community. Just want to come back here and just reflect back on open source for a minute. You can find Linux on the mainframe. And you can find that as we started to refine the types of IT systems that we build right now, today, most of them are reflections or journeys over decades. And we've gotten more open and less costly in almost all of these categories. But there are still areas of new invention where it is still costly, and there probably will still be proprietary entrants for a little while. And we also have open source entrants, but they will bring most of those same challenges to us. So like the freedom aspect of inventing a new cloud platform is not necessarily free, even if we're sharing in it. So if I could encapsulate that in one phrase that somebody else came up with, not me, that I think is clever, it's that we have these historical cycles in our industry where our histories don't repeat. They just look a lot the same. Not exactly the same, but a lot the same. And in this sense, I think we could expect that, just like John said, we're going to keep having more open source activity and more adoption and more integration and more creation. And most of what we do in the future will look like what we've already done in the past, and we can borrow those concepts to get moving forward. So how does this apply to you? Well, let's think about why you're probably here, especially if you're a consumer. I think probably if we talked for long enough, we would get to an answer that looked kind of like this. I'm here because I want more control of my stack. And a central element of every hyperscale success story that you hear is something about how we got more control over our stack. And then all this other great stuff came with it. And in all my time listening to hyperscale talks, my experience is that when you're an audience member in these talks, you come looking forward to hearing some innovation and some exciting new things and to be provoked a bit. But as you sit there and listen and think about whether or not you could take part in it, at some point you start to hear all of these things that are different between that organization and yours. And you stop being quite so interested in the talk, and you start to develop a little bit of a sense of detachment. And maybe by the end of it, you start to think, well, that's really cool what I heard, but that will never be something that I can do. And so the question that I have is, like, why does this process after years and years of shows like this repeat itself? And I think it comes down to, like, a metaphor. When you are watching TV, I want you to ask yourself, what is more motivational for you? Is it more motivational to watch a do-it-yourself show or a beauty pageant? In some sense, I think pretty much everybody in this audience is going to say DIY show, because you can do it yourself. But before you do it yourself in your IT shop, you need to do a little self-analysis. Before you get to do-it-yourself infrastructure, you might want to think about do-it-yourself team analysis to figure out how you're going to get yourself and your org over to that side. So I want to start by stating that, like, while most of us tell a simplified story from the stage on how we do this, and you will hear more of those if you walk around the show today and talk to people tomorrow, we're all pretty complicated, and that's okay. And each one of these factors that you see up in front of you is an aspect that we should appreciate is distinctive and okay as we're doing our own self-analysis. And I would say, as you're doing work like this with your teams, you're going to find that your team probably has many different aspects to it. And they probably bucket, in some sense, into groups. And if you find yourself with a broad spectrum, you can work with that. And if you find yourself with a very narrow spectrum, you might discover that in some sense, if you're all in one bucket, there's another way of thinking about what types of solutions you're likely to build. Okay? If you're just an organization filled with visionaries, you might do something cool, you might make a disaster. If you're just practical people, you're probably not going to develop anything particularly special. And if you're just all safe and conservative, you're probably never going to launch anything, but you won't produce any wreckage. And the best organizations to do this kind of work are not the ones that are all in this bucket. They're the ones that have characteristics of each one of these, because all of them can help you develop something that your organization can ship. So I'm running just a little over time. I'm going to speed up here and just talk about goals and values that I want you to think about. The first thing is, I wouldn't come into this space just thinking that this is about getting into white box. For most of you, this could be a start, but it won't be the end. And if you're here because you care about TCO, you need to build a roadmap for better TCO in your organization. If it starts with lower acquisition cost, it's probably not enough. You need to understand where all of your costs come from and why, and that's more of an architecture discussion, not just a hardware discussion. If I was thinking about my team in this regard and the kind of goals we need to get better TCO, I would try and look for architects that don't mind getting their hands dirty. I would try and look for people in our sourcing department and influence towards the idea that we need to have some adventures in sourcing and not necessarily do everything by the book. There are new practices that might help you do better here. So a little bit of flexibility. And I would think about trying to find software engineers or influence my software engineers towards those that like hardware and they like operations, not just writing code. Try and find those that really like infrastructure as well. Finally, just stop and say, let's do something safe. Let's not introduce a project that is critical path, that is mission critical to our business, where we will fail if we don't succeed in launching this new open source thing. I've seen so many cases where companies make a bet on open source, and they do a kind of a big desperate throw, and they spend a lot of money and time, and it fails, and they shut it off, and they lose all of those benefits for a little while, and they just kind of back off and deprive themselves of a lot of opportunity. So goals, just for a minute. Let's talk about what's realistic. You can take your time. Okay, if you're white boxing now as a matter of strategy, I wouldn't say stop, but I would ask myself, where is this going over 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years? In other words, if all I'm doing is just trying to get to a white box, is that really the only value, or can I, as a matter of testing, develop a roadmap on this technology of my own? And I got to ask myself while I do that, what am I getting out of the way and unblocking if I deliver this new technology for my whole company? That's another good way of testing. What are we going to get for this besides just, a white box? It should be more than acquisition. I can't frame that enough. You want to tell your own story about the awesome DIY and all the rest of that you did. You probably want to say more than just, I'm up on stage and my infrastructure is cheaper. You probably want to talk about all these other innovative things that you did. So you might want to think about how deploying this technology is going to allow you to redistribute the resources that you have to build more services, maybe to improve your security or your uptime or better overall use of your infrastructure. Okay. If you have an organization that came from the cloud world or has gone mostly to the cloud world, you probably have a DevOps org and a sourcing org. And if you come from the world that has a private back office still, then you probably want to evolve in the direction of expanding, whether you're cloud or not, people that have more operating system skills, people whose expertise are in firmware and drivers and can do forecasting services that are a little bit more long-range and not just in-time buy. You'll have probably a bit more of a stretch if you're pure cloud today trying to get back into infrastructure, but you need to add some layers to your organization. Okay, think about your goals. Think about them from the dimension of you can take your time and use some of this freedom to build a new tool stack, to think about interoperability, to develop an infrastructure learning lab, maybe hack a bit. Okay, you don't need to bet the farm. You can learn a lot about infrastructure by starting with some notions of the things that you want to learn and then testing some infrastructure-centric apps. Okay, one last thing, and then we'll run to the end here. I know we're past time. If you're thinking about buying this equipment that you're going to get, networking, to my experience, is pretty easy to source in small quantities. But if you're going to do storage or compute, you need to be thinking about making investments that are nearly rack scale to do really meaningful experiments, not just a node or two. And if you're wanting to experiment with interesting and unusual components, I would understand that working in OCP systems, typically it's hard to find really exotic componentry like you hear sometimes people using that works well with those systems unless you're buying very large quantities of them. So start simple with the components that go into your server is my recommendation, or your network switch, or your storage device. Don't start with the super exotic. And as you heard earlier today, OCP has a marketplace where you can go look at some of these technologies that have been contributed. I've just got a couple screenshots of servers, of integrated software solutions for switching devices, network components, some storage devices. Those are two Facebook storage system pictures. And if you want to get help from the community, you can talk to a lot of people here, but you do best if you find people with like minds and like sizes. And you do best if you try and focus on a development mindset and on a consumption mindset, and not necessarily the mindset of those that don't share your patterns in that regard. You have an OCP marketplace and you have solution providers, but you might need to travel. Okay? This is not necessarily just an online store that you want to work with. You might want to go visit the places that are building the equipment and talk to their people. Be willing to co-market, blog, use social media. If partners in this space that are selling you solutions or developing them are helping you win, be willing to use your brand to promote yourself and their movement. It will help you, it will help them, and it brings a lot of value early on in these phases. And finally, you need to be willing to invest and persist in this for a little while. You will eventually get to something that works, but you've got to give it some time. I come back to my team just at the end here. In the beginning, we didn't have anybody that really understood a lot of what we needed to do here in the deepest sense. Okay? And this one little team, over the course of a few years, built a lot of technology that got progressively more advanced and somewhat influential for the sector that we're in. And yours can be that way too, and it can be a powerful way to attract new talent to your organization. And I wouldn't discount that if you were thinking about what an open source strategy can bring you. It's an exciting new place to work. So, thank you for your time today, and I just want you to remember one last thing. If I haven't convinced you to get into this and kind of shift your strategy a little bit, don't walk away thinking this is not for you. I think that, as John said, and as I've tried to illustrate, open eventually happens. It's just a matter of time for everybody. What we're going to do at the end here is just have a few people come up from service provider space, from solution provider space, and from a couple of consumers to participate in a panel to talk about this. And if they thought that I was full of crap or have controversial opinions, they can say so. And also, I think we leave a little bit of time for you in the audience to ask us some questions. All right. So, Scott?
Yep. So I'm Scott Constable from Vespa Technologies. We're a system integrator. We've been running for about 3 years, working with OCP as a core part of what we do.
Hi. Hi, everybody. My name is Mariano Cugnetti. I'm from Enter.it. We run a public cloud in Italy and with regions also in Germany and the Netherlands. We run OpenStack, and we run parts of our workloads on OCP gear, so since a couple of years.
Liz, do you have a mic? Is that mic working?
Hello? Yes, it does.
Liz is actually our moderator for this, just pretending to be one for a minute. Go ahead, Liz.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm Liz Cruz from IHS Markit, which has kindly been mentioned a few times today. So we track OCP adoption among other data center technologies. And Aaron kindly invited me here to kind of facilitate a conversation around demystifying open technologies, the adoption of them in companies beyond hyperscale. So we've got a good representative panel here, as Aaron said, of operators and on the supply side. So Ami, if you want to pick up with your introductions, and then...
Sure. I'm Ami Badani. I lead marketing for a company called Cumulus Networks. We provide networking software for the modern data center.
Go ahead, Les.
I'm Lasse Jensen. I am a product owner at Booking.com. I work in the data center track. We're a small team of 40-plus people who are looking after the data center infrastructure, the server infrastructure, the network infrastructure that goes between the data centers and in the data centers. So that's me.
Okay, great. And as Aaron said, so I'm going to pose a few questions to get the conversation started, but please, we'll leave time at the end for any questions that you may have as well. So let's start with on the operator side to Lars and Mariano. Can you each say, I know Mariano you kind of hit on, but where you are in the adoption of open technologies and where your organization fell on that spectrum to begin with, from safe to practical to visionary. Where were you? How did that change your adoption of open technologies, and how did that impact how you've moved forward?
I will. So we started in 2011 to research on how we could build our own cloud platform. The first choice, obviously, at that time, since we were a typical enterprise IT shop, so I have seen both faces as you did. And we went to VMware, and we went to the headquarters in Italy, and we asked to partner. And they basically told us, OK, this is the product list, and this is the price list. You can do whatever you want. So we decided that we wanted to be free to take control of our product, and we looked for alternatives. And at that time, the best one was OpenStack, that Aaron knows very well. And we decided to build not only the cloud orchestrator on open source technologies, but everything. So we built the storage on open source technology, of course the hypervisor, and also the networking system. So as of today, our stack is entirely open source. So we spent the last 6 years, 3 of them, the first half on the making disaster part of the visionary. Now we have moved to the practical, which is a good trade-off. So We moved to sleeping during weekends and nights, so we are pretty happy. So we have just moved from visionary to practical with some raids into the visionary again.
Yeah, for Booking's point of view, I guess on the software side, open source has always been something we've been very much involved in. Hardware, however, has been a bit more traditional, off the shelf, just make it work and move on. So not too much complication there. As we grow a lot, and we have a lot of demands as well on not only the growth, but the velocity and how we do things, and we understood that that growth trajectory would give us some challenges in terms of how we deliver our services. And a bit earlier today, there was shown a slide about, for example, disk sizes and how those grew, right? And the last number was 14 terabyte disk size. This is where we are right now on some of our hardware, which means that there's nothing beyond there. There's just like we don't have a solution for the next bit, which is kind of some of the edges of where we are with our hardware right now. So I would say that we are on that spectrum. We're not afraid anymore of looking into to open source hardware. We're practical. We very much look at it from a practical point of view. Does it make sense to do it? We know we can. We know we can use open source switches. We know we can actually make it work. It just has to make sense from a business point of view and from a scalability point of view. So our range of choices, if you will, has just gone bigger, and now it's up to us to choose the right type of hardware, the right type of approach, I would say.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's a continuum, and organizations are made up of personalities and people, and you can move back and forth. It's interesting. Okay. Yeah. So to Scott and Ami, kind of on the supplier side, the point of this presentation was to kind of normalize adoption of open technologies, to demystify it, and the reason that's necessary is because there is skepticism, right? So where do you find that most of your customers exhibit the most cynicism? What aspects of it have the most difficult time accepting? Scott, I know you talked earlier about how there's different pieces of the organization. Some will accept it, some won't. They're going to have to sell it internally. What are the biggest hurdles you're kind of finding there?
Yeah, we kind of always looking at trying to identify companies that are trying to look at going open source or open networking, white box servers. We're just looking around. So once you open up the door, you're looking then for the individuals, because you'll get a lot of pushback, but you'll always find one or two characters that are looking at you in a positive light, and you try and focus with them. And then as you build the relationship, you bring the value, you start bringing more success within that business about exploring that kind of technology. So the negative is generally a positive, because that means somebody's pushing back on you, and that means there's something to be discussed at least, and that's where we start generally.
Okay, interesting.
So I would say that we sort of, we have now about more than 1,000 customers, and I would say we hear sort of three main things from our customers. One is around supply chain. So once they get excited about moving to a more open model, it's, well, how do I procure the hardware? How do I procure the software? How do I procure the cables and optics? How do I assemble this and make it successful? So that's sort of one of the key things that we face, and one of the things that we've had to do to sort of mitigate that against that by providing sort of a more turnkey solution. I would say the second is around reliability. So to Aaron's point around uptime, is this going to be as reliable as what I've had previously? And we hear that a lot. I think one of the ways that the community is really mitigating against that is sort of joining forces and saying this is support, this is reliable, this is sort of the next frontier. As Aaron mentioned, open is inevitable. It's just a matter of time. And so providing sort of a level of support and reliability and kind of walking customers through that journey of how they can be successful with an open model is sort of another key point we hear. I would say the third thing is risk aversion. I think the biggest thing we hear, from companies is we can be safe. We can just do more of the same, do more of what we're used to, and sort of be in that safe bucket. And I think you sort of see these waves of companies shifting over time. Companies that were safe a couple years ago are now moving to a more practical model and realizing that that's sort of the shift forward, and it's not as scary as what it used to be, 3-4 years ago. It's actually, matured quite a bit over time as customers are out there, adopting open technologies more and more. It's been proven at scale more and more. I think people are being a lot more practical with the way that they're deploying and adopting these open technologies.
Okay, good. Thanks, Ami. Kind of staying on that same struggles note then, Mariano, can you talk a little about the biggest hurdle you experienced in your own organization, whether it's the technology or personality conflicts?
Well, the greatest struggle we face every day with every customer we meet, except not being AWS, which is a huge struggle for an Italian company, but mainly it's a cultural struggle. I mean, they are used to have the go-to supplier, the go-to provider. So they go to mommy like that. I mean, they bring every worry they have. But the open source approach, the collaborative communities approach is you are building basically your entire own processes in-house. You are designing it, and you are assigning like microservices to some components, the role of doing something, the storage, the software-defined storage, the hardware, the open compute hardware, etc. So the thing we face every day, it's hard for them to understand that they do have to go back to their goal, not to how do they do things. Like Amy said, is it reliable as the component I used before? No, it's you are building a new process. You are taking out the process and building with new tools, new components. So you have to be conscious of your process. So you have to understand your goals, and you have to redesign it. And then you can plug different components. So I'm not replacing something you already have. I'm doing something more. Okay, so it's a cultural shift. Maybe complex sometimes to understand and to accept and to start.
Okay, that's a significant one, yeah, and it's something kind of Aaron had hit on as well in the presentation, really focusing on the goals. Lasse, can you talk about what your one piece of advice would be to companies either beginning to consider this or maybe early on in the process?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not magic. They're just computers. They run Intel CPUs and normal CPU, normal memory, and they're using hard disks and stuff like that. So if you can make a normal computer work, then you can also make this OCP type equipment work as well. I think it matters if you have a plan to start with, understand what it is that you're trying to do and trying to fix, what problem you're trying to solve, and develop some metrics that you can measure this on. Whether you're trying to measure the power consumptions or the temperature that you're generating, or the density you can do in the rack, or how fast you get stuff into your data center. There could be many metrics that are important for you, but talk about them first. I would say that's it, because then you have that sort of as a goalpost in mind the whole time as you go through that process. There are many companies out there or suppliers out there that also offer half-rack solutions. So if you just want to kick the tires, certainly go out and try and do that. And go, as I think Aaron said, go out and see it, have a look at it, look and feel. There's also a lot of opportunities here. And then put a couple of engineers in a room and just look at it, because then that demystifies the whole thing into, oh yeah, this is just servers actually. What are we talking about? So I think that is one of the advice I would give. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of dip your toe in the water.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, don't be afraid.
Absolutely. Okay, and then Scott, kind of on that same, continuing with the goals, and as Lasse just said, it's important to outline what you're looking for at the beginning, to have metrics. What are you gonna focus on? What are your customers coming to you saying, I have this problem, can it be solved? It may not necessarily be, I'm coming to you looking for OCP solutions. It may just be, I have these problems. What are those, and what are what ones are you meeting with OCP solutions?
As I said, we do OCP, but I think we set sail with the kind of ambition that we could first find OCP opportunities and we could sell to big players. But we realized that it doesn't just happen overnight, and that's taken some time for us to get to that stage, as in the way that you talked about trying to get there. It just takes time as a business to realize that we have to go out and just win little battles. And when we win a little battle, it might be on the network, it might be the storage, it might be the white box server. But as soon as we plant a seed, it just starts a conversation. So network, for example, is always a good one because you talk about not big investment. You can easily get together a 2-leaf and, well, get together a 4-leaf 2-spine, and we can give you that kit to play with, and then we can give you Cumulus to play with, and we can give you some people to support you to do that. So we've recently gone through this scenario where they were using Cisco, over 1,000 switches. In the room, there was 3 people. One of them was nodding his head a lot. The other 2 were quite set in stone. They were Cisco, and over a month and a half, all 3 of them are now excited about what they're going to deploy into their business. We changed their mentality, and I think sometimes people just get hard locked into what they do on a day-to-day basis. And as a system integrator, and what I've learned, it's about helping people make this transition, because, like you say, it's not rocket science. It's everything they know. It's just doing it a little bit differently. And actually, what they get back from it is just more joy from it, which sounds a bit weird, but it is. It becomes excitable. Everyone's buzzing about what they can actually do with the technology instead of just deploying it and putting it to bed.
I like that. Okay. Amit, did you have anything to add in terms of what problems you're seeing from Cumulus's perspective?
Yeah, I think the number one goal that we hear from our customers is they want a more simple, agile, flexible infrastructure to run their applications. So you sort of look at the journey over time from mainframes, where it used to be sort of simple applications with complex infrastructure, to client server, which was like complex applications, complex infrastructure, and then you're sort of shifting back to complex applications, lots of data traffic passing through these applications, and you need sort of a standardized, simple infrastructure that's more agile. So that's sort of the things that we hear most about is, I'm building a private cloud with lots of applications that are going to be complex, lots of data passing through. How can I have a simple, open, more agile infrastructure to support these complex applications? So I think that's where sort of the open model really comes in, is how do you build an infrastructure that's a standardized set of building blocks that you can sort of scale out over time, and that's more agile, flexible for the needs of the business. So that's one of the main goals we hear.
Okay, we hear agility a lot too in our research on OCP, and I think that goes along what you've been saying. Organizations change, applications change. You need technology that can change and grow with your organization. So I think we do have some time for questions. I don't know if there's anything else you guys want to add, or if I can. Aaron, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, this has been great.
Okay, great. So we can go ahead and open it up. 3 minutes. We have 3 minutes for questions. I think that's time for some really, really great interrogation.
I'm sure some of us have time afterwards, too. But please do stand up right away if you have something on your mind.
That's a broad no.
Yeah, this is the awkward phase where nobody wants to go first, right? Yeah.
Does anybody feel like their organization has always been visionary and you're ready to adopt? And does anyone feel they're on either extreme end of the spectrum? You want to be a great example? Okay.
I would also love to hear from any of you who are just deeply cynical about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be
There's a
fun.
question
Yeah.
right there.
Oh.
Right there.
You got to go in.
There are quite a lot of OCP products today, many different platforms. The main ones went from Facebook mainly, and Microsoft and Google seems to be doing something different. So there seems to be a lot of fragmentation. So as a potential user, how do I navigate those? I mean, it sounds more complicated than comparing boxes from different vendors, right? So how do you suggest, as a potential user, how do we look at all these different designs?
Yeah, I just have one thing I want to say about that, and it's unfortunate it's not on the stage anymore, but there was at the keynote, there was a little rack of gear over here that was adapted, sleds that Facebook helped develop and contribute the specification for, developed by MyTac and shipped in a 19-inch rack. A lot of that was done independently, and I think for the opportunities that were there. And I think if you go kind of visit the store, as I was saying, and you survey the supply base, you'll find that a lot of these components that are out there are actually reused in some sense, and that you don't necessarily need to redeploy exactly like what you see in a Facebook or a Microsoft footprint. Like there are many other choices that you have in terms of your freedom to deploy. And I suspect Scott and others might have some feedback there on what they've done that might not be like just what you see in one of those booths and those racks.
We're often, I think every time we come across something, it's everyone's got a different requirement, so we kind of having to build and configure the way they want to so that they feel familiar with it, and then we give them that hardware, let's say, for a time for them to experience it, and it's so quick once they get hold of it that the next thing comes and it kind of evolves. So we have a good reference where they actually didn't want to have true OCP kit, they just wanted to have something inspired by it. They've had it for maybe a month and a half, and now they've got to the point where they're saying, actually, we want true OCP now. This isn't what we wanted. We want the true OCP, and it's an interesting thing. It really is how fast people pick up on it once they dip their toe in the water, as people have said.
Thank you for the question. That was a good one. That's it. That's all we have time for. So thank you so much all for listening, and thank you guys so much for sharing your perspectives and for sharing your thoughts. It was a good presentation, and if anyone has questions afterwards, we'll all be standing around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.